You're listening to Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle, Washington.
Hello, welcome to JBC Connect. We have another episode, and today I'm excited to have our guest is Reverend Douglas Avilesbernal, who is the Executive Minister of the Evergreen Association of American Baptist Churches. And that's a mouthful. We're going to explain, like, what is that? What does that mean? Some of you don't understand, like, what is Evergreen? Some of you might not know what American Baptist is. We'll try and unpack some of that. And beyond that, though, I'm really looking forward to just getting to know more about who Reverend Avilesbernal is and what he does. So thanks again. Doug, I guess, is it okay if I just call you that for the rest of the episode?
Yeah, no problem. That works out well.
Most holy, revered Doug. Doug, I'm so thankful that you were able to join us for this episode. I thought, before we get into anything about your role and what you're doing, I think a lot of people would be really interested in just hearing a bit about your background, like what you've done. You've done so much. I feel like it's going to be almost impossible to summarize, but I think it's really cool. Like, you're just very multifaceted. You have a lot of different things in your background, and I thought it'd be really cool to just talk a bit about, who is Doug and where he came from. So maybe you could just start off with that.
Yeah, well, where to begin,
Yeah.
So I'll just set up quickly think my family is a missionary family, and my parents are from different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And my growing up was in third countries from that. So it was a good bit of moving in significant ways. Like, we would move maybe every 3 to 4 years, and that, so on the one hand, that gave me a really amazing upbringing, because I got to, and my parents really believed that you lived where you were, because sometimes missionaries carve out a little piece of home in whatever country they live, right? They just have, they gather with people from the country, and they have a little piece of home there, and then they travel from that to the country, as it were, to minister. My parents were the opposite. My parents really believed in fully living where you were. So we never stayed in sort of like expat communities or things like that. We always lived in places that people from the place lived. So that helped me see cultures in different ways and in deeper senses. So that helps with perspective tremendously.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. You're kind of just framing it and deciding like that. So, like, how would you identify, like, culturally or ethnically then? Because it's so diverse.
Yeah, I don't. This is my biggest difficulty. Normally, my usual practice is to say that I'm from the previous place I was at. So right now that I'm at Evergreen and I haven't been here 3 years yet, I often say I'm from PA, from Pennsylvania. But that's just the place I lived at before. My difficulty in this question is that I don't have a homeland, as it were. There's no place where I feel I'm from. I use nomenclature. Like, if people ask me where I'm from, and generally people ask me after I say I'm from PA or the US, they say, but where are you really from? And there's a little bit of you're a foreigner tinge in that, and you could ascribe negative or positive descriptions to that as you wish. But so generally, when pressed in that way, I say Guatemala. That's where my mom is from. That's where I was born. But my first move out of Guatemala is before I was 3. So am I from there? Yeah, I was born there, but so I don't know. That doesn't really quite explain it. But so I have
I think that's great.
Yeah, I have no physical attachment to a place.
Yeah. Well, I want to say, like, I really appreciate that. And I kind of want you to flesh that out, because I think that's huge, because I'm Korean Canadian, right? My parents immigrated to Canada. So I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, but then, I've lived in 4 different countries. I'm now in the States as a permanent resident. And it's this whole question of, like, identity and space, and the way we frame it, I think there's a real problem to it, right? Because when it comes to people like us, right?
Yeah.
we get across that. And, Doug, I've had the same experience as well. It's like, where are you from? And well, I'm from Edmonton. And they're like, no, where are you really from?
Mm.
And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And I remember when I was living in England, I was talking to this young man, and when he came up to me and he saw that I was Asian in a very white town of Liverpool, speaking English, but American English to him, you literally just saw like his brain was melting. He couldn't comprehend it, because he just didn't have a world view that was big enough to like realize there's people like us, who are like, not just like monocultural or even bicultural, but maybe like multicultural, right? I think that's just something that we really need to come to terms with, like have better language to talk about people and identities. I think this would actually be really good to just move into, is that one of my first introductions to you, actually, I just knew your title, but the first thing that someone did to tell me to get to know you was they showed me a book that you wrote about diversity. And I know this is a big passion of yours, so I thought maybe before we go into your title, maybe talk about this book and maybe your passion for diversity, since we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. So this is the beautiful part about it, because by being brought up as we are, right, the sense of loss from welcoming diversity is not as big as someone who's grown up in the same place all their life. Yes. And I think this is the root of the problem, especially in the United States, that is so monocultural. To welcome diversity, it feels like I'm being stripped of my home to a lot of people, because home to them is rooted in this specific culture, this specific place, this specific space. And it seems to be a finite thing. It's a size. So it's not like it seems like there's no language, like you said, from the guy in Liverpool. There's no language or mental space to grow that room. So it just feels like any welcoming of the other is taking away from the space I already have. And that, I think that's the root of the problem, right? So when there are people like us, like for example, I don't have a spatial understanding of belonging, a specific land. So welcoming others is not a big deal for me, because I don't feel like, it doesn't feel like an invasion. It feels more like another menu, another item in the menu, So for me to welcome the others, sort of like, oh, cool, let's see what cool stuff you bring that I didn't even know I was gonna love. But when you're in a monocultural world, in a monocultural space, speaking one language, knowing one space, that stuff feels like it's taken away from me. So that's the pain of it. But the reason I'm so for it and I'm so excited about it is that, well, I think if God didn't want it, God wouldn't have created it. So I often think of St. Augustine. It says all that is good because God made it. Of course, then sin gets into that, but at the core of that, right? So I think I like diversity because I say that there's got to be a good in it, and there's got to be wealth there that we're not exploring. Just like perspective alone, and then maybe when we move into Evergreen, we could explore that part. But just perspective alone, as you welcome diversity, just improves your world tremendously.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's like this isn't just like a trendy thing that we're pursuing. And I really like what you're saying, because there really is like a whole biblical narrative from the beginning, is that God is really interested in people and nations and diversity, right? I mean, it's even though it started very particular people, right? There were even rules for God's people about outcasts, and even in the time of Jesus, just like having the narrative of wise men coming to see Jesus was like really like mind blowing, right? To see that this wasn't a message just for a one people group. It was going to be like everyone was going to come to see Jesus. And you see that all throughout, of course, Paul's teachings, just being a missionary, going through the nations and Revelation.
Yeah.
And these are things but I guess I just really want to echo with you, and like for our listeners to know that this pursuit of diversity is not just like a socially trendy kind of thing.
Oh no, I think if people are prepared to hear it, and that's the difficult part, but if you really
Yes.
want to push it, one of the things I think, one of the most powerful messages about this is that when there was a monoculture that was so good, they thought they could be the best ever and maybe even reach into the sky. What God did was create diversity to keep them from loving themselves too much.
Yes.
In
Yes.
the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Right? That's the thing. It said you think you are too much because you're the only thing.
Yeah.
So diversity was introduced as a means to say, in essence, get over yourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, isn't that like such a powerful message? What you just said, like about the current tribalism that keeps happening in our world today, like that just really is such a relevant, strong story to just like what is going on. So I think this is really great to maybe segue a bit and to tell us a bit about what is this association of churches that we're in called Evergreen? Because it's very unique, and I'd argue, in my estimation, and talking to some of my peers, I think it's unique in the entire country, just of its approach and what it's trying to do, since we're talking about diversity. So maybe just in your own words, could you introduce us to this lab, introduce us to what Evergreen is?
Yeah, I have a question before that. Should I introduce the ABC, American Baptist Church's thread into that, or start with
that's a good point. What do you feel is best? I think
there's
I'll
a thread.
Yeah,
I think there's a thread, so I'll do it quickly. So, ABC, American Baptist Churches, is on its second or third name, but it all started, we were just a Baptist association all together, started in the early 1600s in Philadelphia, and it grew throughout the country as we became a country. I grew through the colonies and we became a country. Then, just before the Civil War, there was a big debate about whether our missionaries could take their slaves with them into the field. And one section, the Northern Baptists, said, no, we should not have slaves. They were abolitionists. And the Southern section said, of course they should bring their slaves. How are they going to do ministry if they had to do all these other things? So that's where the big split happened. So we became the Northern Baptist, and then we had the Southern Baptist. The Northern Baptists have more of transformed, adjusted, changed. So have the Southern, but the Southern have kept their name. They're still the Southern Baptist. We are now American Baptist Churches USA. So we were born out of the struggle for freedom toward welcoming, right? Because we wanted to say, even in that time and that language, even the blacks are welcomed as children of God. Whereas the other side was saying they're not our equal, so they're not. So we were born out of that. There were a bunch of other things that American Baptists have done. We have always been on the side of freedom. Of course, there are exceptions because we're free to decide. But generally, there's been an American Baptist group, congregation, etc., on all the big milestones towards freedom. So the suffragist movement, the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement. So there's always been many of our churches in the Northeast were part of the Underground Railroad, for example. I pastored a church where our mother church had compartments, hidden spaces in the church building to house runaway slaves. So from that journey is that Evergreen, once again, is born out of conflict. What happened was there was a church that had been welcoming and affirming of if you're in the religious world, you know what that means, but if you're not, in essence, means that it's a welcoming of those who feel that the homosexual lifestyle is from God in a way, right? So this church was welcoming and affirming, and the difficulty was they decided to make that public. And the association, which was called the American Baptist Churches of the Pacific Northwest, then did not like that. They were fine with the church being sort of private about their welcoming, but once they made it public, they didn't really like that at all. So they moved to this fellowship church. What happened then was remarkable. A bunch of other churches in the greater Seattle area said, if you disfellowship them, you have to disfellowship us. And not all of them were welcoming and affirming. They were just saying that's not if we're going to talk about freedom, then let's find other ways. So then it became a problem because now it was a significant number of churches. And they spent a long time arguing, and they could find no way to reconcile those two things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how Evergreen was born. It started with one church, but what made it happen was the support of others who were not necessarily of the same mind as that one, but they were in support of their freedom and understanding of the gospel and God's love.
Mm-hmm. And then, so just for listeners who are kind of new to this story, like how long ago, like what year was that, or like
this was in the early 2000s. It sort of started in the late 90s, but by 2001, 2, and 3, that's when all of this happened. So it's very, very new. It's a very new group.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that because if you're following like American churches and stuff, I would say this dialogue is actually much further ahead than other parts of the country, in my estimation, in terms of like the conflict and that kind of subject. So like when they were going through it, there probably weren't a lot of other denominations or traditions that they could look to kind of see like, well, what did they do?
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was early on, and that has been the case with American Baptist churches in every instance. So when we went through the female ordination struggle, it was ahead of many others as well.
Yes.
We had women ordained in the 70s and such. So so it continues this thread, right, of being on the risky side of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I think that's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
No. That's that thought was complete.
Well, no, I just, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. It's so amazing because my mind is swimming just to kind of like think of wonderful things to talk about. But I think it's interesting, right, how you framed it, because it started with a particular issue, but it wasn't actually about the issue itself. It was more about what the issue was about, was that it was basically the reason why churches stood in solidarity with that church was because they knew like Baptists are about the freedom of like self-defining their congregations.
Yeah.
And they felt like this was at risk. So it wasn't so much they were trying to change that church's issue. And I think it's fair to say like the church we're talking about is Seattle First Baptist, right? That was at the locus of all of this. For our listeners, I think that's okay. So, but it's interesting is that the people that went in solidarity weren't about like, we're going to change Seattle First. It was more like, we want to stand in solidarity, whether we agree or not, because Baptists really value that churches have a right to be self-defining, and they want to really make a statement about that. And I think that's a very different nuance, right? Than a denomination coming from on high and just trying to make everyone agree to the same position or something.
Yeah, it's a significant, and also there's a tinge of something that I find very important that says that if you feel someone is outside or beyond where they should be, the last thing you should do is leave them or force them to go. You should remain in covenant relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's a difficult way to go, right? Because the easiest way is to keep purifying by excluding. Mm-hmm. You know, so you keep excluding the people who don't think like you do, and then it narrows, and then it could, there's a danger in that, which I think
maybe because Tower of Babel, right? Like
that's right. Yes, the very same danger in that.
Yeah.
You know, if you're only spending time with people who think exactly like you do, there's no growth, there's no depth, and you run the risk of becoming an extremist in the negative sense of that. You know, because I think Evergreen, and maybe if we want to move there now, Evergreen is an extremist in the positive sense of the word. You know.
Yeah, and I think that's really exciting to just think about how this is actually a template, even though this is 20 years ago we're talking, it's so relevant to what's going on right now, is that I think there's the whole thing with like cancel culture, just a lot of like fear, is that whoever we stand in solidarity with, like it immediately means endorsement too, which it can, but like this whole thing with like Evergreen is showing you can be in solidarity, doesn't necessarily mean endorsement, but it could also just mean like the solidarity may be greater than that. Is it really like a one-to-one thing? And if we can nuance it better, then maybe we can get out of this cycle of, it feels like all we can do now is like choose our tribes, you know?
Yes, yes.
But like, how could we like figure out a way that, hey, we can be in a diverse group of tribes, but still like unified, you know? And I think that's the only way forward, right? In this current time.
I agree. And that's what I love about our system, right? It says, in essence, it says, we value your tribe and we profoundly appreciate your depth of attachment to it.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to preserve that. Mm-hmm. While at the same time, we want to remind you there are different tribes who are just as valuable as yours.
Yes.
How can we live together?
Yes.
Because living together is the better option. So I love that about Evergreen. You know, I think this was a godsend in the sense that it's almost as though it was designed for these times. Yes. Without knowing, right? It was a very prophetic thing, not in the sense of foretelling, but in the sense of preaching the good. So so I would describe it in like sort of an elevator pitch. I would say it's radical, Christ-driven equality, more like equity. Mm-hmm. In that it has two main components. It has to be diverse, and it has to value that diversity profoundly in what they are, right? So should I give you a rundown of who we are now, or?
Yeah, please do. And I think it's really important that you also talk about how unique the governance structure is. You know, it's just very unique in the way it was decided. So yeah, please tell us more.
Yeah, so we'll say, the most controversial thing about us is that we are organized in ethnic caucuses, right? So we have a Black caucus, Euro caucus, Asian caucus, and Hispanic Latino caucus. Usually people who don't see color tells us that that's just separating people by race, and it increases racism. But it doesn't work the way for us, because the reason we do that is to value who God has created and how God has created us, right? So it's like God has created us in different ways, and these different ways have general categories. You know, so we have Euro Americans in this country, we have African Americans, we have Hispanic Latinos, we have Asians. Each of those, of course, has a wealth of diversity within them as well, you know. But there are this sort of things that help us. Now, being divided in that way, then we had to do something on the governance side to help us keep from ruining it ourselves. So what we do then is that, for example, quorum for us is not number of people. Quorum for us is presence of diversity. So we cannot make any choice of significance if our diversity is not fully present and heard. And that's very important for us, you know. And then we make sure that diversity is applied at every level in our organization. You know, from our churches to committees, to the executive board, which functions sort of as a governing board of the association. Our executive board has to have 2 representatives from each caucus at all times. And if they're not present at a meeting, we cannot make any choices. You know, so it's this constant reminder of the value of God's given diversity and the importance of their presence in order for us to make a choice. You know, so we, in essence, we're living into Romans by saying that we're all part of the same body. To one has been given this, to one has been given that, you know, and so we want to live into that. So that's one aspect. So that's the diversity part, right? To say that we feel that because God created us in this diversity, we could only function by acknowledging, welcoming, and listening to as much of it as we can.
Yeah, and I just want to like insert here why I find this so interesting is that like the divisions that you're talking about of caucuses is not for the sake of like profiling or whatever, but it's really an equal distribution of influence and voice, right? I mean, I think in that way it's so innovative because to know that like I'm a part of the Asian caucus and to know that my voice is just as strong as the Euro caucus or the Black caucus, that's something that I haven't experienced in the many different church traditions I've been in the past. It's often been, and it's been very demoralizing and discouraging. It's like, well, I guess I could get involved at the denominational level, but I just don't feel like they take me seriously, or I don't have a platform, or my voice will not be heard as much because of the size of my church or how I look or something. But Evergreen's like this organization of the caucuses is extremely empowering, in that all are equally valued, and we can't go ahead without any of the caucuses left behind. So we're all in it together, for better, for worse, you know. And if it's going to be hard and long, then so be it. And I think that's just a really profoundly countercultural approach, right? I mean, I don't know many models. I don't see that really happening anywhere right now.
That is beautiful, and I think
so powerful.
Yes, I think an important part that I forgot to mention was that another benefit from this is that we understand that there are cultural differences, and with them comes wisdom. We know that each culture approaches issues differently. So by having all of our cultures acknowledged, we get the benefit of this broad perspective on any issue. You know, so whenever something happens in this country or in the world, it's very likely that we as Evergreen not only have someone who's intimately related with that, but we have the benefit of seeing it from their perspective. And that's just richness that is remarkable. You know, so that's the wonderful thing about it.
Yeah, and I think it's also maybe, I really want to highlight too, something that I'm observing about Evergreen that's really interesting is that it did start because of the schism in the Northwest, but we're starting to draw people from all over the country. It's not like we've been advertising, right? I mean, you've told me that, but
we're very deliberate about not advertising.
Yeah, but people are so interested, and they're people, again, it's not like one issue, right? It's not like, this is what I find really interesting about Evergreen, is that it's not defined by a proposition or an issue, but its actual key value is diversity and equity, right? And then, and because of that, then it attracts a lot of people who are on the margins with different issues and different, and it is like theologically very diverse in a lot of ways.
It very much is. And I love that. So for example, here's a beautiful way to put it, you know, to say, if we were led by traditional understandings of power, right? Then, so for example, if we were led by number of churches, or Euro caucus would win every time. If we were led by number of people, our Black caucus would win every time, because one of their churches has almost as many people as all of our Euro churches combined. And if we were led by either of those, the Asian and Hispanic caucus would lose every time. You know, that's just the way it would go, because so we have this radical equity that in some ways would seem unfair to many. So for example, it would seem that it would be unfair to the Black caucus, you know, because if we went by numbers, they could just bring, you know, their churches into a voting place and they would win everything all the time if they could be united on anything. But they get 2 representatives. If we were same with the Euro caucus, everybody gets 2 representatives. So the value is not necessarily in the temporal benefits that you bring. You know, so it isn't how rich you are or how many people you have, but rather the value is in how God has created you and how that benefits the community.
Yeah,
and that's a remarkable upside down sense of justice. You know, so
right, and that's such in contrast. Like even within the Baptist tradition, there are places where I'm observing certain churches, because of their pull, like financially, or like just of mind share, of like people knowing like this is a flagship church of some kind, whatever that means. Like they can push things more, right? And then when you're talking about, for instance, churches that are based on like a community of immigrants or something, which many Asian American churches are, they can really be left on the margins. Like I've heard about some churches assessing those smaller immigrant churches and seeing them as failing or as insufficient according to like a white culture standard, you know? But that's why minorities don't go to that church, and they're kind of like scratching their heads like, why is that? And And I think this just kind of like leveling of the playing field realizes and recognizes that we need all churches of all kinds,
Yeah.
and they all have a valuable place in the kingdom of God. And if we could have these kind of things, we could just, you know, just stop wasting all that energy and comparing, and just realize like we're all in this together. I think it would just be such a shift. And I feel it when we get together at Evergreen in our annual meetings, that camaraderie and that support is definitely more than I've seen in other larger denominations I've been a part of.
Yeah, and it really, I mean, I love it, really lives out the body imagery, right? So it really lives out that how could the ear tell the eyes, I do not need you, right?
Yes.
So we understand we're radically different communities of faith that at the same time cannot tell each other, I do not need you. You know, and that's, I love that about Evergreen. You know? So maybe I'll give you a rundown of the way we function in order to make choices, right? The process for us to make a choice, which I think illustrates this radical equity. You know, so whenever we have a choice of importance, all caucuses gather together so that we all hear the same words being said at the same time. We are all in agreement. Heard this. How we interpret that is different, but that we have heard the same message is what's important for us. So we all hear it together. Then we split into our caucuses and run it through our cultural, communal, tribal filters to understand our perspective on it and to get our opinion of how we feel about this question. Once we've done that, then we come back as a community, and each of the caucuses tells us their perspective and their opinion on the matter. And if we take any of those out, our system doesn't work. It has to have all of those steps in it. But what we get at the end of that is we all get to sit in a room and get this beautiful picture that is broad and deep on the issue from various perspectives, right, as long as we're willing to listen to, right? And it is only after that we get to the question of what should we do about this.
Right. And I mean, and that's more difficult. Not everyone will be completely happy because like they're not, no one gets completely what they want, but it does a spiritual discipline of like serving others or like submitting and leaning into others, right? So that we can all come together, which is totally what we need right now in the world.
Yeah, and it's a spiritual discipline because any caucus at any moment could stop the process, and we have to go back to our caucuses with that particular group's suggestion and see what we decide.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a profound, intentional work, I think. So I'm blown away by like how quickly time is passing. I just feel like I could talk with you forever about this because there's so much I want to say, and I do this to all the people I'm interviewing lately, and I say like we're gonna talk again. So Doug, probably in the future I'm gonna tap you again. We'll talk more because there's so much more. I find it very easy to like ask more questions about this stuff. Maybe in closing, maybe you could tell us a bit about what are your hopes for where Evergreen is, and I mean where we're headed. I guess like hopes of what you think Evergreen could bring to where we are right now, just like with everything that's going on in the country, which is many. But yeah, maybe some of your thoughts as the head of this.
Yeah, part of our vision as Evergreen says that we will share our unity with the world. And that's where I would like Evergreen to continue to work on, to say that there is a way forward that includes us all and includes our differences going forward as God wanted it. So I think part of our reconciliation process and our choice-making process is a beautiful way to engage with the difficult in a way that is healthy, keeps our eyes on the issue, not our differences, and recruits our differences to aid in getting more sustainable solutions. And one of the things I like about Evergreen is that our process allows us to make a choice that is more sustainable. Because even the ones who lost are not the losers, you know, they're just the ones who decided to make a choice for the community at that moment. And they know it will be better in the end for everybody. And that's a remarkable difference. You know, whenever you get into winners or losers, you're in trouble. You know, but when you get to a place where you say this is best for the community, even if it's not exactly what I want, then that's different. Then that has love in it, and then that makes it a more sustainable choice, and that's what we want. So I think one of the things that Evergreen could contribute is that. And lastly, I'd say that the other thing that Evergreen could contribute to is that our system is designed to keep power from pooling any specific place. So we're always fighting against the power pooling somewhere, you know, not as in the sense of the pool, but it's in the sense of POOL. You know, we want to keep power from being gathered in a specific place. And I think that's a system works well when it's always working to keep any group from having too much power. You know, so it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. And, you know, for me, I just take a lot of comfort in knowing that, that that Evergreen was birthed 20 years ago. And that it's been a part of the mission statement of Evergreen to talk about like diversity, about racial reconciliation, questioning like the corruption of power. Like it's just, it's in its like formation DNA, you know? And so it gets, and then it is working. It's not like a faddish, like idealistic thing. Like it's been working for 20 years and it continues to grow and gather attention. So when we're kind of facing this unprecedented time, like in 2020, it just helps me to know that Evergreen has been doing this for a long time. And because they have been doing it, like we can do this going forward. So it gives me a lot of hope for the country is that maybe we don't have to create something unprecedented and new. Like maybe the answers are right here, and maybe we're further along than we realize. And so I'm really hopeful about that.
Yeah, Evergreen has grown every year, and we'll be welcoming new churches again this year.
Yeah, I have no doubt, and I can't help but wonder if we're just going to keep growing because people want to be part. I mean, not that we're forcing this; we're not doing a campaign for it, but it just feels like I can just see a lot of churches would want to be affiliated with this kind of philosophy and approach. Doug, I am so thankful for this conversation. I can't say enough how much of a blessing it is. And why I'm so excited about this particular podcast and our conversation is like, I think it's so much more than just a JBC podcast episode. I feel like this is so relevant to so many different people's, like even outside of faith. Just to hear that we're talking about this very thoughtfully from our spiritual perspective. So really, I'm really going to be praying for what God will do with this conversation that we've had, even though it's short. I feel like there's a lot God could do with it. And the last thing I'm going to say really quick before I go out, I know I did that twice. I guess preachers do that. We always tack on one more thing.
That's right. Yeah.
This is something I just been dying to ask, is that this story of Evergreen is so special and so precious. I really hope we can get it out there publicly. Like, I would love to have this on the website. Like just what you did at the beginning, if we could just like notate that or something, just like slap it on there, like the dates. And I want to like, I just want people to like, they could go Wikipedia, like just find this, you know, like, cause it's just such a good story to tell, you know?
I agree.
So
you gotta do it.
Just my 2 cents. But anyways,
no, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Always a pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you. Really blessing you and your family through these special times. So thank you again. And and tune in next time for JBC Connect, where we'll have lots of guests, reflections, and all kinds of things coming your way. Thank you.
Thank you.